Morgan, thanks very much for being on the podcast.
Thanks very much. As an pleasure talking to you today.
I've read your book more than a decade ago, and it's fascinating. I think from the person who never knew anything about oil, upon completing it, I was a go-to person for all my friends when it comes to oil discussion because it has so much information in there. But one thing I wanted to start with the conversation with, I sent you an email, right, about inviting to the podcast, and one thing you said, forget about what Fed does, watch oil. I always say that if you locked me away for 10 years and gave me no information except the spot price of oil, I could tell you exactly the state and the 12-month performance outlook of the global economy. Can you elaborate on that?
I have this kind of view, and it's kind of a systems approach to the economy, in that energy is key to economic growth. And you have oil, which is the number one source of energy globally. It's obviously mostly used for transportation. And it is so essential and so enabling of the global economy. In other words, it enables economic growth. That if it becomes scarce and prices go up, oil prices go up, it will cause a recession. And sometimes it needs to go up because it needs to go up in order to encourage additional barrels of oil to be produced for E&P, exploration and production companies to go out and look for and drill for more oil. So sometimes the price needs to go up, sometimes the price needs to go down to encourage a little bit more consumption. And the reason I say forget the Fed and instead watch oil is that if you look at every recession over the past 30, 40, 50 years, they have almost all been directly preceded by a spike higher in oil prices. So if you look at just before COVID even though obviously that was more of a exogenous type incident or event where it was caused by the COVID. But if you look at just prior to the housing crisis or the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, oil prices went to $150. There was a major recession. Going back into the 1970s, and every time there was a major rally in oil prices, there was a major recession. And also, oil caused, in my view, all of the inflation. We have this concept in the Federal Reserve, and economists look at this concept of core versus non-core inflation. I have a view that all of it is energy. There's no such thing as core, non-core. There's core inflation, which is traditionally energy, oil prices, natural gas, coal, and that inflation, core inflation, is caused by changes in energy prices. And then economists will say, oh, well, non-core inflation is caused by other parts of the market changing in price. I have a view, and I think it's backed up by fundamentals, that energy also is a key driver of those, what are called non-core inflation components, such that almost all inflation is caused by energy and oil in the modern era for the last 160 years. I mean, the oil industry literally only started 160 years ago. People think it's been around hundreds of years, so it's a very, very new industry and only recently at major scale. But and the Federal Reserve, it's been around longer than the Federal Reserve, but oil price spikes have directly preceded every recession over the past 50 plus years. And since there have been kind of a free, openly traded oil market since the early 1970s, I can explain why the oil market became more freely priced starting then. But if you look at oil prices right now, we've got WTI in the low 70s, Brent, which is the kind of more Asian/European benchmark, that's in the high 70, 78. That's showing right now there is no recession coming in 2024. Here we are on early January 2024. Oil prices are saying there's no recession. The economy is fairly well balanced in terms of its energy needs. And if you look at the forward curve is slightly backwardated, as in if you go out 2 or 3 years, oil prices, you can buy today oil for delivery 2 or 3 years out for the low 60s, $60 a barrel. So inflation is moderating. This is what oil prices are telling you right now. The global market is well balanced in terms of energy. There will be no recession in 2024. unless oil prices change to cause that, which could happen if there's some event in, say, the Middle East or things like that. But right now, oil prices are saying there's no recession coming in 2024, uh, and that the outlook for the next couple of years is decent levels of growth, and that the oil market and other portions of the energy market, natural gas and coal, can enable that growth. So that could change if we have oil prices, something happens. But yeah, I think that the Federal Reserve follows oil. It reacts to changes in economic fundamentals uh, caused by oil. Here's another example. If you look at the soft landing which we had in 2023 and 2024, everyone was predicting a recession in 2023. That soft landing was not enabled by the Fed, raising interest rates really quickly. It was instead enabled by the U.S. administration dumping 1 million barrels of oil over 6 months from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve into the market. So the US government acted almost like the Fed of energy for a brief period of time, 6 months. And so the SPRs, this stockpile of oil, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, is controlled by the US administration, and particularly the president can control it. He doesn't need any permission from Congress. It was created in the 1970s to enable this. It was meant to be for strategic reasons, back when the US was a net oil importer. But the US Biden administration sold a large amount of oil into what could have been a spiky oil price scenario, where because of Russia, the Ukrainian-Russia situation, and basically the US government, the Biden administration, sold oil from the SPR and kept oil prices from rallying. And that is why we had a soft landing in 2023, not because the Fed did their thing, good for them, but they did it in a little bit after oil prices had already told the market that there was not going to be a recession due to a spike in oil prices.
You mentioned that at current prices, you don't see the recession. At what point would you think, okay, the recession is coming? Like, what's the normalized price of oil?
I think right now we're $70 to $80 a barrel for WTI or Brent. At that price, the market seems to be, the economy seems to be growing at an okay clip. The global economy, the oil producers at the margin appear to be able to produce at a decent rate to satisfy that demand. So at $70 to $80, there doesn't seem to be any stress on the energy side of the global economy. And so I think as long as we stay $70 to $80, given that range for in 2024, as long as we stay around there and we don't go to say 100 or 120, then I think that we will not see a recession. I mean, remember, just prior to in 2022, we had oil prices were up to $120 a barrel. That was when we had a lot of calls of people, and rightly so, we had a lot of calls for people saying that we were going to a recession. But then you had a confluence of things. One of the major things being the U.S. sold a lot of its strategic petroleum reserve, and also the Middle East and Russia. There was a little bit of a fear premium in the price of $120 a barrel. That never came to pass. In fact, I actually think, contrary to what you see on TV, it's very sad, the whole situation in Israel Palestine right now. But the Middle East has been, with all due respect to the terrible things going on, it's actually a very stable environment, much more from at least from the energy market, the oil market's perspective, much more stable than it has been in 20, 30 years. Surprisingly, you've got a lot of the economies, the young economies, are very keen to open up. The Saudi Arabia, the UAE, other parts of the Middle East are trying to modernize their economies, trying to move away from oil is one of the major things they're trying to get at. But because of that drive, and a lot of it's probably because they've citizenry have got access to the internet, they can see that there's better lives by being a more stable economy. And the Middle East is a lot more stable now than it has been in a long, long time. We used to, if you're in the oil market, trading oil, we used to lurch from crisis to crisis. It was always a perma crisis in the Middle East. Nowadays, you can kind of see that the long-term trend is towards peace, and we do have terrible situations going on as we do at the moment. But the longer-term trend is the Middle East has become more stable, Russia is kind of contained in terms of the Russian-Ukraine situation doesn't seem to be escalating. And one of the other things, in addition to oil being the major driver of the economy and telling you if there's going to be a recession or not, $70 to $80. So as long as we stay there under $100, there's no recession going to happen in 2024. And another thing that oil does is that it also is one of the major causes of conflict. If you look in history, World War II is famously oil. World War One was a lot of that was enabled by oil. You had airplanes for the first time, flying over battlefields. You had tanks and cars on the battlefield. World War II, you had, Russia famously went south to try and get to, and as did Nazi Germany, to get to the oil fields. That was the kind of the major reason, one of the major reasons, World War II, Hitler went east when he shouldn't really have, when he had to, because he needed oil. That's why Japan went south so far down to Indonesia. They had to. Japan doesn't produce any oil. They had to. And so one of the major weaknesses, it is the most strategic commodity, oil. And because, as I said, it is essential. You cannot have an economy. We would all be back to being subsistence farmers without oil. That is just reality. And people can dream that we're living in an internet age and a metaverse age and all this kind of stuff, AI age. It doesn't matter a damn unless you have oil coming out of the ground. That is what enables modern life. And I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just saying that is actually how it works. The world works on oil.
What happened with Russia? Because you have this oil embargo, right? It's supposed to cripple Russia. Obviously, I know people who live there, and originally they were really afraid that they're going to be a major recession, but seems like they adopted and seems like they're doing quite well, quite frankly. And as you said, oil is stabilized. What's going on?
The number one reason sanctions do not work is that oil is a global market. The US, there are regional small variations, but it's a global market in that if people say, why should the US defend oil coming out of the Middle East? We don't consume those exact molecules coming out of the Middle East. We consume the ones coming out of Texas. And the reason is that oil is a global market. It's a global pool of similar type molecules, hydrocarbon molecules. It doesn't matter whether those molecules are produced in Texas or in Russia or in China or in Africa or South America. It goes all into the same pool. And if prices become more expensive in one place, they become more expensive for everyone. So it's like saying we're going to lower the level of the ocean just around Russia, so it can't put its ships to sea. It's the same type of thing. You can't do that. It's a global market, and so the EU and the US put in sanctions on oil. I mean, you can sanction certain things. You can sanction people's bank accounts, which has a blowback. I mean, people now are trying to a certain extent, move their money away from dollars because they realize that the US can sanction individuals' bank accounts, rich oligarchs in bank accounts. But to sanction oil as a commodity, the challenge there is that oil will find a way. If you manage to cut back production, say if the US managed to cut Russian production by 10%, what would happen would be the price for its other 90%, the oil price would go up to compensate. So if you remove the Russian oil, whatever percentage, 20% from the market, the price will go up by enough to kind of compensate Russia for that. Russia will get the exact same dollars or currency coming into its coffers if sanctions are at 80% of Russian oil. If you said cut Russian oil production by 80%, the last 20% that Russia sells would be at $200 a barrel because the world oil price will go up by $200 a barrel. The world needs Russian oil. That's the thing, it's pointless to sanction Russian oil. It fundamentally doesn't work. And then, not just does it not work because the price will react to compensate Russia or whatever the sanctioned country is for the less amount of production. So their total revenue will be the same. So Russia gets roughly the same amount of revenue today as it did in 2019, 2020. They do it actually producing less oil because of the sanctions. So it's actually sanctions are a win for Russia if you look at it perversely. So they just don't work. So why bother? I mean, it helps for to look like you're doing something, but for politicians to kind of pretend that they're doing something, but they don't work. I mean, those sanctions on oil don't work. And I mean, the worst thing for Russia would be $50 oil. That would be bad, or $20 oil. It would be bad for not just Russia, it would be bad for most oil producers, including the US. The US is now the number one oil producer in the world and is the largest country in terms of production. No country, the US produces 21 million barrels or just over 20 million barrels of oil a day. No country in history has ever produced 20 million barrels a day. And just to put that in perspective, the world produces and consumes roughly 100 million barrels a day. So that's to give you a sense of scale. The US is 1/5 of that production. So the US is just as dependent on high oil prices as anyone else. And but having sanctions, to get back to your point, having sanctions on Russian oil, it does nothing to Russia. It actually, if anything, has a perverse, it helps them a little bit, the Russian economy.
But
It
is it
doesn't matter.
just because the price is being they compensated due to higher price, or because they found new partners in China and India and able to sell it for cheaper? That's what I read
Compensated by
somewhere.
high price. They found partners in China and India, and oil will always find a buyer. It doesn't
Uh-huh.
matter. There's sanctions have been tried in many other countries. Iran sanctions have been tried. There's always ways to get around it. There's the illegal ship, and it's not illegal. It depends on which legal region you're talking about. Say Iran has for years had oil sanctions on it because the world is trying to, the US in particular, is trying to stop their nuclear ambitions. And so what Iran does is a tanker, these very few super tankers in the world, oil tankers, it pulls into the Middle East, into the Gulf and the Middle East, turns off its transponder, which is this AIS signal that it's used for collision avoidance. So ship captains have it on there. Like an airline has got like a transponder, like an airplane. Ships have the
Yes.
same thing to stop tankers hitting each other. And all the radar systems or communication systems of ships, they talk to each other. So, and you can just go on the internet and Google AIS, and you can see every small ships to big ships in the world. And tankers, just like any ship, they have this on to stop them hitting things by accident or in the fog or things like that. So, but the side effect is that you can track all these tankers. And so, the way that Iran gets around sanctions, everyone gets around sanctions. So North Korea gets around sanctions, but it's kind of funny how they get around them in Iran. The ship pulls into these are huge ships into the Middle East. You can see it steer down the middle of the Gulf, turn off. All of a sudden, the transponder turns off. And the ship captains always say, oh, there was a cloud, because the transponder signals are radio signals. And they can say there's a cloud, the satellite couldn't pick it up, or the ground station couldn't pick it up. And then, strangely enough, 2 days later, transponder will turn on again. It's in the meantime loaded millions of barrels of oil from Iran, and it'll call over to a ship or to maybe just Saudi Arabia or some other country, and they'll load like 1 barrel of oil or some token amount, whatever it is, or they'll transship from some other ship. And there's no DNA in oil. Like, you can't say these molecules of crude came from Iran or Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's different types of oil, but you kind of
Yeah.
mix it all together. It's like the ocean. Where did this bucket of water come from? Did it come from the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Baltic? Who knows? It's just water. It's just, you could tell a little bit, but not exactly. You can't say it's not exact. So the ship will load up with a barrel token amount of oil from wherever, Saudi Arabia or UAE or somewhere, and they'll call the entire tanker now, which is full of Iranian oil, with a little drop of Saudi crude to wash it. And the next port of call will be Texas, to a refinery, a few weeks later, or to Rotterdam, to refinery, to India, to China. And what is India buying? What's China buying? What's the refinery in Europe buying, or America buying? They're buying UAE oil. They don't care. They don't ask for like, it's not like art, or the art market where they look for the history of ownership of the molecules. No, they just do a test, and the tanker is full of crude. The owner says the last port of call was Dubai or UAE or Saudi. It's Saudi oil. Okay, I know what the grade is, and it's probably been blended anyway with something else. And so basically, there's all sorts of basic, and the U.S. government knows this. The State Department, everyone knows this, and the oil market knows this. Sanctions just don't work. It can make it look like, it looks like you're doing something, but it's not. They just don't work. Even when there's no sanctions, you have things like in China, you get all this illegally imported oil or legally exported oil, but it's primarily imported. And it's two ships pull up next to each other. It's called transshipment, two tankers, and you can load oil from one to the other. There's no one following exactly who's doing that. You can tell a little bit from following ships, but the oil market operates kind of outside of governments to a certain extent in terms of,
Uh-huh.
and everyone will go, whoa, that shouldn't be like that. Well, it's the blood of the global economy. It'll find a way. And sanctions don't really work. I mean, it just doesn't. They do. You do get made some disruptions. You know, when if there's supply disruptions. You know, if Russia, for whatever reasons, decided to have its production tomorrow, oil would be $150 a barrel. So you can get, governments can have an impact, but sanctions historically have no impact.
But didn't you discuss in a book the API, and there is different types of oil is better for refinery, or like you
Yeah.
get.
So so basically when people talk about oil, usually, they usually mean crude oil. So the stuff that comes from
Yeah,
the ground,
yeah.
is crude oil. So basically it is, it can be all these different colors. It can be like a dirty tea, like or coffee kind of color and consistency, or it can be sludge, or it can be, you got oil sands up in Canada. It can be like treacle, like very thick and viscous. And so oil can be, there's all these different kind of grades of oil. At its core, they all contain hydrocarbons. You have to take any grade of oil. The first thing you have to do is, well, one of the first things, I'm very, very simplifying here, is heat it up. And then all the various fractions or parts of the oil will kind of boil off at different levels. Some of the boils off first are the very light things like gasoline, and gasoline is motor gasoline or gas or petrol, what most people sell in the car. And it boils first, or one of the first things. Then you get down to jet fuel and kerosene that boils off next. Then diesel is very similar to jet fuel that boils off. And then you keep going down. You have to, the next thing to boil off, these are getting heavier and heavier. You go down to residual fuel oil, the stuff burned by ships out at sea because it's so polluting, or historically has been, that you can only produce it at sea. And we're getting down to now the more difficult to burn things in an engine. So if you burn, look at a ship engine, one of these Disney cruise lines or something like that. I don't want to pick on them, but the smoke coming out of their stacks, it's all because they're burning this heavier fuel that's more difficult to refine. And then the worst thing, but the bottom of the barrel, it's literally called the bottom of the barrel, is things like bitumen. These are used to produce roads, that you mix them with stones and you produce asphalt. You can just make highways and streets. So all of these different parts of oil are produced from all these different grades of oil. So crude oil. So the world produces 100 million barrels per day currently of crude oil. These can be very light in that they contain a lot of gasoline, or they could be very heavy, like up in Canada, where they contain less gasoline, more diesel, more of the heavier things, more the shipping fuel, more the bitumen, more of the heavy things. But and they're all graded by this thing called the API. And so it gives them kind of like how much of each product, like based on its
Mhm.
API, how much each product is produced on average in a refinery. So, and refineries, there's, refineries around the world try and buy, they're like, it's like Starbucks. Starbucks, they don't buy their coffee from one guy. They say they do occasionally, but, they'll buy it from one guy with one Starbucks bush in the corner over there. They have to buy a blend of millions of bushels of coffee, and they have to blend it all together to get that exact flavor profile every single time globally. So same with a refinery. They have to buy all these different grades of oil from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, uh, all the different countries, blend them together, and to get them, and then refine it to boil it all down to get these different grades. So they'll choose different grades of oil. They're called grades of oil. They buy API content as well as some other things like sulfur. But they buy these blends, just like the Starbucks coffee guy buys all these beans from different farmers, and they try and mix them together to blend them together to get and you have people at oil refineries who buy the crude oil from all around the world. And they are blenders. They actually blend the inputs to the refinery before it's heated up and boiled off. And they're trying to get that same exact mix, because the only thing that's standardized really is the output. Like when you buy gasoline for your car in
Yeah.
Texas or New York or Chicago or LA or Moscow, it kind of is the same car engine. In Australia, there are slight variations because sometimes it's the weather's warmer or colder, things like that. But generally, it's roughly the output that a refinery produces, a certain grade of gasoline, It's the same everywhere in the world, roughly. So oil refineries buy all these different grades of crude, they refine them, and they produce these different products, and they try and get the products to be all the same grade, such that you have, say, Reliance Petroleum, which is a big oil refinery in India. They produce gasoline that meets the specifications for gasoline in Europe or the US. And depending on whether the price is higher in Europe versus the US, they can send their ship of gasoline after they've refined it in India. They can sell it in India also, but they can send some to Europe and some to the US based on if the price is higher. So the oil refineries kind of sit in between the oil refining. By the way, I know you were, as an investor, you're looking at like which parts of the oil industry is most lucrative. Oil refining is a terrible business. Being the middleman, where you're just sitting there buying the crude oil. Historically, I don't want to be negative on oil refineries because it's a very intense business, but and basically all they're doing at its core, it's more complicated, I'm simplifying here, is they buy the crude oil, store it in these big tanks, boil it, and they do all these other things. They crack it and they do all these other chemical things to it, but they break apart molecules, or they do a bit of chemistry, but nothing too complicated. Like, this is science over the last 50, 75 years has all been, well known. There's no secrets anymore. And they then produce it, they then have to sell the finished products. But being in the middle of that refining business, it's a business where everyone always goes, oh, the US, we don't refine all our crude oil. Well, good, because the US is smart. They realize there's no money in refining, very little money, unless you have 15 years of glut of too much capacity globally to refine oil. You'll have, like, even right now, the world has got 110 million barrels, 110 plus million barrels of oil refining capacity. The world only produces and consumes 100 million. So you're in an industry, it's like car manufacturing. It's almost always an overcapacity, because who doesn't want to run their own refineries? India wants its own refineries. Korea wants its own refineries. China wants its own refineries. Well, good luck to them. Strategically, they're saying, oh, it's so important. Well, it's because governments get involved. The refining industry globally it's a business where there's 20 years of terrible profits, followed by maybe 2 or 3 or 5 years of okay profits, and then go back into, because you get this big fixed cost infrastructure of refineries being built, and you can't turn them off and turn them on. They're fixed cost operations. So of all the oil industry, that's one of the toughest parts to make money. And I don't want to knock the oil refineries, because there's some well managed good ones, and unfortunately they're at the fate of the world, in terms of every country in the world thinks strategically we should have our own oil refineries. Well, I mean, it's economically, it doesn't make any sense. You're better off letting some other sucker build a refinery and buy the
Hey,
finished product.
we covered a lot here, and I'm like, there are a few questions and that I want to ask you. So, because this refinery is looking for different blend, so they do know which oil is Iranian oil.
They know what Iranian oil, the characteristics of it are, but they won't know that a specific grade of oil has been produced from, there's no DNA in the oil. They'll know, like, it's literally like you take a bucket of water from the coast of Iran and a bucket of water from the coast of Los Angeles, and it's all water. I mean, can you tell that the water came from the coast of Iran? Yeah, it's kind of like crude oil. It's a naturally occurring element in the ground. And so you can tell there's a difference, and it probably did come from Iran, but you can't tell exactly. It's like, because it's just hydrocarbon molecules. It could have, and very often they're blended and mixed together on ships and in pipelines and things like that. So you can't really tell 100% definitively
So
that it's Iranian oil.
sanctions don't say like you cannot have Iranian oil in your, I don't
In
know,
your tanker, they say that, yeah, but then,
you
yes,
can't buy it from Iranian company,
yeah, as
basically.
well, and so the things to try and make the sanctions effective, countries try and say, okay, well, you can't insure tankers from pulling up to any port in Russia that loads oil. So, but the problem with that is that some people will say, oh, I don't need the insurance. I'll just pull up to, I don't need London, Lloyd's, or, London shipping insurance. The Korean government or the Chinese government is going to insure me. So basically, there's ways around it. There's no very difficult to get for sanctions to have an impact.
Well, let's move away from sanctions. So we talked about the pricing of oil. Remember that episode when oil was negative in pricing?
Yeah, I mean, I never thought I would see that. That was so shocking. But and people were saying that it was fake somehow or something. But the thing about oil is that oil is a real-time commodity in that when you buy oil at the gas station in the US or petrol station anywhere else in the world, that oil kind of came out of the ground as crude oil maybe 2 months prior. No one stores oil like they store like gold or something like that for because it costs a huge amount of money to store oil. You have to build the tanks. You've got to build all these safety facilities around the tank, in case it leaks. The oil evaporates in the tank if it's a hot day, so you're losing some of the oil through evaporation. It becomes bacteria eat the oil, grow in the oil, and make it sludgy. So no one stores a lot of oil. The only oil that's stored in the world for commercial reasons is of necessity. So the world operates on almost on a just-in-time basis. It's produced, say, 2 months ago, and you're pumping it out of the ground, out of the station in Texas. That oil could have been in the ground in Saudi Arabia 2 months ago. So it's real time. The market is real time. That's why it's like blood. If you stop it for any reason, it'll find a way around to get to the market very quickly because people don't want to store it. It costs roughly, it changes over time, but 50 cents a barrel to store oil per month. So if you store oil in a barrel, in a tank, per month, it'll cost you $6 a year per barrel. So if you buy oil at 80, for example, and you want to keep it physically, you're saying, I'm going to keep it like gold. But the cost roughly would be about $86 in 1 year that oil will have cost you. And then after 2 years, it'll be $92 in 3 years. That's why if you're an investor, you've got to be very careful about what you choose, how to invest in oil. Like you notice you don't see anyone like saying, oh, we're going to offer an ETF with physical oil in tanks. No, because that costs a lot of money. And so getting back to your question about how did oil prices go negative in start of COVID in 2020, in March of 2020. So oil prices had been, I say $100 or give or take just before COVID. So up until the prior December of 2019. And so oil demand stopped pretty much like 25% of the world's oil demand because people didn't drive to schools, didn't drive to work, or didn't drive to and from, didn't go on vacation. The world's tourism shut down, all these things. And that took out 25% almost within a month of global oil demand. Production is still going at, 98 million back then, 98, 99 million barrels per day. All of a sudden, demand drops it was around 10 million barrels or 20 million barrels per day. And so that 20 million barrels per day or 10 million barrels per day all of a sudden had to be stored somewhere because the oil producers are producing. It's coming out of the ground, and you can shut down production, you can turn off wells, but if you do, it messes up the economics of the well. As in, you can't turn them off and on so easily. You can do it a little bit, but it damages the amount of oil still in the well. Like you basically want to produce at a steady flow. That's the most easiest way. People think oil is pumped from the ground. No, almost 100% of oil comes up from the ground naturally, just through two pressures. No one pumps the oil out of the ground unless it's a very, very, very old oil well. It just comes up just because the pressure gradient between, 3 miles down and the surface of the earth. And so the oil comes out, and producers do not want to turn on off their oil wells. So, people will say, well, why don't they just turn off the oil wells in Russia, turn them off in Texas when they see the storage tanks become full? Well, every producer in the world, it's like a prisoner's dilemma. They're all looking at each other going, someone else should do it. Like, just like OPEC, Russia looks at or OPEC plus, Russia looks at Saudis look at, other countries. Everyone looks at other countries to cut back production. So the world, everyone's looking at oil consumption has dropped by, say, 10 million barrels or 20 million barrels a day in February of 2020. The world is still producing, say, I'm simplifying it, the world is producing 100 million barrels a day back in 2020. All of a sudden, and consumption is 100 million barrels per day. All of a sudden, and consumption is very stable. It doesn't change more than 2 or 3% maximum a year for 150 years. That's how much it grows up and down. It's very stable. For the first time in history of the oil market, oil demand dropped by 15, 20% overnight. All of a sudden, the producers are still producing 100 million barrels a day. That oil has to go somewhere. It starts filling all the storage tanks. And these storage operators, people that own storage tanks, are saying, yeah, it's 50 cents a barrel, 50 cents a barrel. All of a sudden, now their tanks are getting all full rapidly. They're saying, okay, let's charge $5 a barrel per month. And all these oil producers are saying, yeah, we'll pay that. Oh, let's charge, $10 a barrel per month to store it, the oil. And these producers are still, like, it's so difficult for them to shut down production economics wise and then restart it that they're saying they're going to suck it up and produce, even though prices are going down. They're down now, going down to 20, 10, 0. And they're saying, we're going to produce. We know the oil is not being produced. For us to shut down and restart production is going to cost us, such a huge amount. We're going to, for a very short period of time, fill storage tanks. And the reason it went negative, like you'd say that oil should just go to zero. The reason it went negative is that you still have to pay. You now have
Yeah.
to start paying someone to take the oil. So
Mhm.
for a very short period of time, it was like but it was logical that it went negative. And I know all these traders, booking systems couldn't handle negative oil prices. Could never happened before, and it was completely logical. It was just that the oil market operates like a blood flow system. If you to stop that consumption, never happened before in the 150 years. Um, all the storage tanks got to full, and then people are still producing. So now people are saying, okay, tanks are full, the pipelines are all full, people are still producing the oil. You can't just dump it in the ocean. Back in 100 years ago, maybe you could have done something like that. But you can't do that today. People are now okay, well, we'll pay people to take it and burn it in their. So it literally went zero, or say negative for a brief period of time. And then obviously producers started cutting back production a little bit and
Mhm.
consumption recovered really quickly. And but yeah, it was very, very unusual. That never happened before in the oil market.
Did you buy?
No. Oh
Why?
my God. Well, here's the thing. Who knew how long that thing was going to last? I mean, it was the first when things, all people in oil markets or any market, people do back testing. It's the bane of every, quant on desks, quants on
Yeah.
desks. They do back testing this, and it's a very difficult job because you got to have clean data. The biggest challenge with back testing is that is the data clean, and then is there like is it causation and without, correlation and causation? Are you looking at things that cause each thing or not? And the, I would always say to myself and say to others that I trade with is that the thing about history is that things reverting back to the mean and things like that is that sometimes things usually do revert back to the mean, especially for big things like the oil market globally, like where there's billions of people involved and millions of companies involved. Things do tend to, with such a large data set, revert back to the mean. But sometimes the mean changes and it reverts back to a different mean. And so I didn't know whether this was going to be a new structure where maybe there'll be lockdowns for the next 20 years or 10 years, and no one knew. I mean, it was kind of a
Yeah.
shock that it went down, shock that it went back up. It was, and it was new history. It's, doing back testing and things like that are useful, but sometimes the mean changes and you revert back to a new mean. And that was, not that example of the COVID negative price happening. That wasn't the first, and only time a mean in oil market has changed. If you look at, since, back in the late aughts, 2007, 2008, back when Oil 101 was first published, everyone thought peak oil was the thing. We're going to run out of conventional production. And what happened? Oil prices there was the Great Recession, caused
Mhm.
by oil. So there was a big spike, $150 in 2008, because certain countries were struggling. Like they had misjudged. Saudi Arabia was the number one kind of part of that, but they misjudged the growth of Chinese demand and the resilience and strength of that demand, and they couldn't keep up with production. So prices need to get up to a high enough level to stop the economy, to give the oil market a chance to reset. And the
Mhm.
oil market, when it reset in 2009, 2010, after the Great Recession, reset up to a different mean. And that mean was after fracking. And so the last 10
Oh.
years or 12 years have been, the new mean has been fracking. But the problem with fracking is that fracking costs money. It's not like you just drill straight down conventional oil production and the oil just comes up. Now fracking, and I'm oversimplifying here, but you have to drill down, then turn the drill bit sideways, then drill
Mhm.
sideways for 2 miles. And that distance, the lateral, it's called in the oil industry, has been grown such that now you've got some of these uh, wells they're at record lengths of how so much sideways, and you try and steer the drill bit through the reservoir. It used to be, remember, it's just drill straight down like a simpleton. It was
Mhm.
because it was easy. And now you've got to do all this kind of steering the drill bit because now the technology can also enable it. But that whole development of fracking, it required $100 oil. And so after the Great Recession, we had 5 years of $100 oil very stably. and it paid for the oil market to transition to keep growing with consumption, but it reset the new mean now for oil production because fracking, it costs, on the cheap side, $40 if you have for a company like Occidental in the US, for them to produce a barrel of oil. Remember, 15 before the 2009, it would have cost, that would have been expensive oil. It was like $20 a barrel was roughly the average production cost. After 2009, it's now with fracking, $40 a barrel, kind of table stakes to get into the fracking business because all the technology. If you look at these sets, they're like a technology play now, where oil has always been, but just it's more technology and expensive, and so fracking has changed the mean downside for oil prices to $40 a barrel, and so that fracking revolution, since it started in 2009, no one fracked for oil before 2009, almost no one. And now it's the reason the US is producing 20 million barrels a day. The US was in steady decline since the 1970s. And where did fracking come from? Why didn't no one think of it in 2005 or 2000? It was started in the nat gas industry in the US, natural gas, and that was in order to stimulate, they call it, but start more difficult gas reservoirs, natural gas reservoirs. Natural gas and oil are very related. They're very often produced together. A lot of fracked oil production, liquids production, produces a lot of nat gas or light gases like NGLs are called, ethane, propane, butane. But the technology was a new technology in the early aughts. Some random guys in America, like wildcatters, went, I'm just going to try this technology. And it worked for natural gas because they said, I'm just going to pump water down, use explosives to break up the rock. And they found, actually, I can produce a lot of gas this way, natural gas, but it produces the well stops producing very quickly. Okay, so they just have to frack again and frack again. So they have these frack pads that move along a reservoir doing this. And people then in 2009 went, okay, this is before 2000 oil, before oil rallied up to over 100. Oil was, say, 40, $30, $40, $50 a barrel. It wouldn't pay for fracking. At $100 a barrel, it paid for fracking. So now there's all these guys that were working in the nat gas industry turned around and said, hey, at $100, we can try and frack oil reservoirs. And they started fracking, and it took off. It took off in the US at least. And there's a reason fracking took off in the US and is still going strongly in the US and didn't take off in the rest of the world. And the reason is, in the US, if you own a piece of land, so if you buy an acre of land in Texas, if there's no other contracts that you had to sign away, you own every piece of land right down to the core of the earth as a private citizen. So you buy an acre of land in Austin, Texas, or Dallas, you own everything right down to the not the government. The government can tax you on it or something, but you own it, and you own all the oil in there. So if you own oil, any mineral in the ground in the US or Canada, you own it privately. If you own the surface and you own the mineral rights. Almost every other country in the world, Russia, Europe, Australia, everywhere, anything under the surface, the government owns. And so no, the government's not going to take any risk doing all this fracking, this very expensive production of method. And you have some environmental things in Europe, Germany, and France to stop it as well. But the reason is, in the US, you have private ownership of minerals under the ground. You buy an acre of surface land, you own in the US everything to the core of the earth, any minerals. And so you might just stick a flyer. Hey, I think oil is 80. If I can frack for 40, I'm going to try this. Whereas in most of the rest of the world, in Russia and other places, they won't invest in the technology as much as in the US, because any mineral rights are owned by the government or taxpayers, but the government on behalf of taxpayers.
So you own everything underneath, but like in fracking, you have to do it horizontally, right? So
yes, well, technically you're not allowed to drill under someone else's land.
okay.
It's called subsurface trespassing. Wars have been fought over that. Remember the Kuwait war, Saddam Hussein in Iraq in 1990? He started the war. His reason, like his what do you call it, causa belli. The reason he said he was going to war and taking over Kuwait was that he said the Kuwaitis, who produce a lot of oil or had produced a lot of oil, were drilling down they were drilling slanty underneath into Iraq. And he said they were invading Iraq, the Kuwaitis, and he started the war. The original 1990, 1991 invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein it was started because he said the Kuwaitis were invading Iraq through a pipe. They drilled sideways into the Iraqi oil fields. So legally, you're not allowed to do, it's called subsurface trespass. You're not allowed to drill down and then sideways into someone else's land. You have to buy the person up above on the surface in the US. You have to buy their mineral rights. So if you go to Western Pennsylvania today, over by Pittsburgh, you've got these people. They're called landmen. Even the women are called landmen, but they go out in peace. They go out and the job is to go to private individuals, farmers, people that own a couple of acres here or there, and they have to buy the mineral rights from them. So the person can still have their house, but the oil and gas company will say, hey, I'll give you money. Usually they give them a cash payment up front, and then if they start producing gas, not gas or oil, they give them extra payments. And because they can't produce the oil and gas, they can't drill underneath someone's house at 3 miles deep because that person owns that. They would be stealing that person's minerals or oil. And that's where, obviously in 1859, if you probably learned from Oil 101, that's where the oil industry started. There was a guy in northern part of Pennsylvania, and they were looking for some lighting fuel, like because they had whale lights. So imagine that up until 1859, not that long ago, like our great grandparents or something like that era, at night, everyone, didn't matter if you're a king or some pauper, anywhere in the world, up until 1859, you had a fire. You could light a fire at night in any time of the winter or whatever. Maybe you could burn a candle from beeswax, or if you were rich, you could burn whale oil from the blubber of whales. That's so expensive. But most people had a fireplace. So at night, up until 1859, you had no lights. Imagine that. This is pretty real. Like how far we've come in like that 160 years. That's it, 160 years. You were in a mine. Didn't matter if it was the king or whatever. They had no light at night. And so in 1859, this guy went into Pennsylvania, and he drilled down, thinking that he could use this oil for lighting, and he produced this new fuel. And it basically, the oil industry started 1859. It kicked off, and it was basically started off for the first 40 years just used for lighting, just to give people, they get kerosene lamps. Kerosene now, after electricity became more common, kerosene is now jet fuel. So if you look at it, they basically, when they jet engines can burn anything. They can burn like whiskey. They can burn gasoline. They can burn diesel. You can burn all these kind of things. Jet engines they prefer, obviously, and they're designed to burn certain fuels. But mostly they're burning kerosene because that was the part of the barrel that oil refineries produced after the widespread use of electric light bulbs that they couldn't find a good use for. So they said, oh, let's use it in jets. And so kerosene was the original for the first 40 years, 1859 to 1900, 1910. Kerosene was a lighting fuel, and then after 1930s when jet engines were just invented, and so that kind of part of the barrel is now used for jet engines. So
you know how there is Walmart, right? And there is also like mom and pop shops.
yeah.
Is there like something similar to in the oil industry where I found oil underneath, and can I just go somewhere and get the pump and start pumping oil out of my little land, or it's not, I don't have enough scale to actually.
Shockingly, there is.
Whoa.
Yes, even today. So you can, if you go to California, is big, everything's California being a green place. I don't know if you've seen that movie, There Will Be Blood, with Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yes.
And I think it's loosely based on John Paul Getty. Remember, Getty was this big oil producer. I think someone asked him once, what was he's a Californian crude oil producer, and someone asked him his keys to success were, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something like, wake up early, work hard, and discover crude oil. As his definition of how to get successful. And basically in California, all these old oil wells, it doesn't really happen outside of the US. The US was the original start of the oil industry. And because you can have private individuals, you can buy an individual well. They're called stripper wells because they kind of strip the last few bits of oil from an old oil well. Because oil wells, they come out with natural pressure because the pressure of all the rock underneath the surface is so high, the oil comes up naturally by itself. That's why you get gushers.
Hmm.
And you can get people, and they're called nodding donkeys. I don't know if I'm on video, but they're kind of like these
Yep.
tilting things.
Yep.
Those things actually pump out those last few drops. It's like sucking on a milkshake, to use the comparison to the movie There Will Be Blood. But it's like sucking a milkshake. That's a very old oil well, like modern, like Exxon and Chevron and people like that, and Hess and Saudi Aramco. They don't get bothered. They don't bother when oil wells get to that extent, that old. They just cap the well. They produce take the pipe and just put a cap in it and just walk away or do whatever remediation they have to do. But in California, some guy will buy like 50 of them or 100 of them, and he'll get a loan from the bank, and he'll have his pickup truck, and he'll go out and he'll service these things, and he'll have a tank right beside the oil well. So you can buy a little portfolio of oil producing wells. They're high cost. They might cost you $50 a barrel because you got to go around like a superintendent managing these things with wrenches, make sure they're working. But all around California, sometimes they disguise them, make them look like houses for just to make them fit in with the environment. They're all around California or and other parts of the country. You see these small individuals buying these stripper wells, and you'll have a guy that owns like 100 of them. You need to be good at maintenance, like plumbing, because you need the pipes and filling the crude tank, and then every 2 or 3 weeks you get the tank is full, and you get some guy to come by with an oil tank, fills up the oil, and drives it to a refinery. So it's a high cost. Like Exxon wouldn't be bothered. They'd say, "Hey, the economies of scale are not good enough." So there's a market, sub-market, and it's not immaterial. It's like a couple of million barrels a day of US crude oil production is produced by this method of little mom and pops. They own oil
Oh,
wells. California, I think Texas kind of got like a little bit of a market. Um, but you'll see it just if you just Google stripper wells. Hopefully, you don't get anything too salacious in relation to the oil, not related to the oil market. But that's what they're kind of known as, and they're really old oil wells. Old as in, usually when you drill down, the natural pressure underneath the oil, oil is basically decayed algae from oceans from millions of years
mhm.
ago, and it's trapped under a rock, and it basically cooks all these living creatures into oil over millions of years. Originally it starts out with coal, and then it turns into oil, and then it becomes lighter again, natural gas, and so it turns into like over time. And so usually the pressure is strong enough you don't need the pumps. But then after you've gotten most of the oil out, most people either just cap the well, or you might sell it to some of these guys that'll buy. They just collect oil wells.
So what do they do with that oil? Do they go to some
The refinery,
refiner?
yeah, the
Okay.
gathering, yeah, they get a small, another business will be in the transportation. You could call them the midstream of the local
Yeah.
midstream. Upstream is the actual production in the oil industry, the actual getting the oil out of the ground. Midstream is transporting the oil, and that you have guys with trucks and rail cars and or pipelines, and they'll just take the oil to the closest refinery, and the oil refinery. It's kind of like I know as a kid, when I grew up in Ireland, when mushrooms would grow after it rained, you just pick the mushrooms, bring them to the local restaurant, they buy the mushrooms off you. In the US, you just bring the crude to the refinery gate, and there's all these companies that are involved in doing this. These are usually small, sometimes not that small companies, but they're usually not publicly traded. It's like these mom and pop
Hmm.
operations, and they'll produce, say 500 barrels a day. That would be decent sized production because 500 barrels multiplied by or $100 a barrel, and then all their costs might be 50 or something like that. They can make it work. It's a good return on capital, but it's a high maintenance. It's like owning apartments.
Mm. Hmm.
The pipes freeze, or some kid breaks some things, and vandals break the punch holes, and they shoot holes in the tank, and
Obviously, there is like depending on how much reserve it's still in there, but like I'm just curious, what's the pricing for those type of individual wells?
I've never done it myself. I'm aware of the industry, but there are these brokers that do it, that will sell you a portfolio of these wells. Like they'll try and get like in a certain area, because you need some guy to drive around and fix them and maintain them to make sure. And also you need to get the delivery trucks to pull up to get the stuff to be taken away, the crude oil producing. And it's not just in the US. You have in China, you have what are called teapot oil refineries. So in the US, the mom and pop type thing, you have very few small refineries in the US. You have some big ones because oil refining is like a
Yeah.
scale business. You just need to have a huge, pretty straightforward business. As I said, very little new technology. There is some, but has been added. You're basically boiling the crude oil and it evaporates into the different products, gasoline, diesel, and so on. But in China, you actually have teapot refineries, and these are people that buy crude oil. They can buy them from wherever, from a ship from Saudi Arabia, whatever, or just buy a few 100,000 barrels or something, and they'll refine it. If they'll actually have mom and pop oil refineries, and they're usually not that environmentally friendly. They probably have accidents and blow ups and all that kind of stuff. And oil refining is a dangerous business, and or can be dangerous. And so you can have mom and pop in China. You have the government try to shut them down because they're highly polluting. They're not very efficient. They're all dangerous. Then in the oil industry, you also have, I wouldn't call them necessarily mom and pop, but a lot of the midstream, like the shipping, like tanker companies are usually very small. Everyone thinks Exxon and Hess and Chevron own their own equipment and their ships and things. Very little. They actually, most of the oil industry is about, it's like they outsource everything. So
Hmm.
some of the mom and pop companies that are huge mom and pops, they would own ships. They'll own, Greek shipping companies, Norwegian shipping companies, and so
Hmm.
they'll lease them out to Exxon or lease them out to Chevron and places like that. And so you have midstream is the transportation of oil is you get a lot of kind of small operators there, and then so you do get small operators throughout the industry, but it's basically a scale business. Like imagine the world produces and consumes 100 million barrels. It's a huge amount of oil every day. When you look at, everyone talks about these days electric cars and how much, every car in the world that's not electric pretty much runs on oil. So 99% of the world's cars today, even with Teslas and BYDs and all that, 99% of the world's cars still run on oil. Like at the margin, newer cars are starting to run electricity, but there's a huge incumbent base of cars out there. The average car in the US is now 18 years old on the road. So there's a huge base of oil burning cars, either gasoline or diesel. Imagine that you've only got, with all the talk about electric cars, it's only 1% of the world's cars are electric. 99% are still oil. And so it's a huge, huge industry. So very few, and in like any kind of huge standardized industry, scale works. That's why there are very few mom and pop operators.
Let's talk about upstream, midstream, and downstream. Like when it comes to public companies, like can you tell me again what those are, and like share with us like at least one company that you think is the best in that field, so people can just
Okay.
look it up and see how they operate. So and you can
Okay.
learn.
So I'm not a financial advisor, and this
Yeah,
is
of
not
course,
financial
this is not
advice.
financial advice. Yeah, it's gonna be
Yep.
like
So,
a disclaimer. Yeah.
um, so you've got the oil industry is broken into three parts. You've got the upstream, midstream, and downstream. Why it came to be these terms? I have no idea. I mean, it kind of makes logical sense, but it's like, kind of confusing. Like, why isn't, anyway. So upstream is where the E&P companies, E&P, exploration and production. These are the companies that drill holes in the ground, pretty much. There's some things other than drill holes in the ground you can do. Up in Canada, they dig holes in the ground, oil sands. But mostly you drill holes in the ground and you get liquids out, and those liquids are sold. It can be all sorts of liquids, NGLs, crude oil. And that is the upstream part of the business. And they call it exploration because these guys go out and look. They've got geologists and seismologists. The oil industry is the most technologically advanced part of any industry in the world. Everyone thinks, oh, oil is very backward business, whatever. No. You go to look at the technology that's involved in 3D modeling and engineering. It blows away any other industry in terms of its technology because you've got to find this oil. That's the exploration part, and you've got to
Mhm.
produce it. Like say, for example, most of the oil production in the world is produced by government oil companies, like
Yeah.
state-owned oil companies, Saudi Aramco, places like that are government-owned or highly government-controlled. Like in Norway, they've got a government-owned oil company, Equinor. So you've got most of the world's oil is state-owned oil companies. These are E&P upstream. They explore for oil and they produce the oil. When they say produce, they drill a hole, get the oil naturally comes up, and they try and do this in the most cheapest way possible, ideally on dry land. This, Saudi Arabia drilling in the desert or drilling in Texas on dry land, and the least amount of work you have to do, the better. Then you get other parts of the E&P upstream. You've got more expensive fracking that became a thing over the last 10 years, mainly in the US. And so you have companies that do servicing the fracking companies. So you've got companies like oil service companies that are also in that upstream area. So these are Ensco, these are publicly traded, Schlumberger, Halliburton, Baker Hughes. And what do these guys do? Someone like Exxon will pay Schlumberger, Halliburton, Baker Hughes money to frack. They'll say, you frack the oil. Halliburton will pay so much per day. You get your men and fracking equipment, and this pad moves over the oil reservoir and drills a hole and drills sideways and pumps the water and fracks it and moves to, 20, 40 feet and does the same thing again, or 100 feet. And so the offshore, the upstream is these E&P companies in the West and in the US and parts of Europe. There's a lot of private companies. Other parts of the world, state-owned oil companies. They service out to oil services companies. They have to do the fracking, or if they go offshore, it gets more expensive as well because you have to go build a rig to sit out in the middle of the ocean, drill down into the ocean. That ocean used to be, could be, you might have to drop the pipe 3 miles down through the ocean, then drill another 3 miles through rock, turn the drill sideways, drill another 5 miles sideways. And all of this thing is very expensive. So you've got companies that are all, again, oil services companies, all in the upstream area. They were looking for exploring for and producing, getting the oil out of the ground. These companies are drill ship companies. And these are companies, there's a whole industry here of people who lease out their rigs. And these rigs cost an offshore oil rig to drill. So you're Exxon, you say, hey, I want to, as an example, drill for oil in the Gulf of Mexico. I want to hire this drilling rig. Exxon doesn't own its own rigs. It hires them out from these oil services companies. It'll pay that rig company $50 million per day.
Gee.
$50 million per day. Like that's the scale of, the company. Imagine, so 10 days, a decision of some engineering group in Exxon to do 10 days of drilling just to see, and they're looking for oil. They don't know there's going to be oil. They drill a lot of what are called dry wells. But a 10-day drilling escapade, some smart guy has done some modeling, or team rather, has done some modeling and says, hey, we think if we drill down here, we've done these tests, seismic using sound or looking at all other, using other scientific equipment. We think there's oil over here, but we don't know until we actually send a rig over, drill down, drop the drill string down to the surface of the ocean, say 2 miles down, 3 miles down. It's freezing cold down there, and there's no light, so you have to heat the drill bit and any liquids that come up. You drill down another 3 miles. I'm just using this as an example, into the rock. Then you have to turn the drill bit and drill sideways, try and drill it right through the sweet spot of a reservoir, and then you've got to frack it, or potentially frack it. So this, just the drilling part, you haven't started production. You're just going on an escapade here.
Exploration, right?
$50 million a day. And so the scale of this is massive, and the risks are massive. But then the upside is that these guys make these are calculated risks. So all these companies that do the fracking or the offshore rigs, they are in the services. They, like Schlumberger, Halliburton, Baker Hughes, Ensco, they help the E&P companies, Exxon, Chevron, go and they provide services to because Exxon doesn't want to own a rig all the time. They want to own it for like 2 months or 10 days, and then the next time it could be BP rents it out for a few days. And so there's all these oil services companies that are publicly traded, the Halliburtons and so on. There's the upstream companies like the Exxon, Occidental, Chevron. They're the E&P companies. That's all in the upstream part, finding the oil and drilling for the oil. So there's the E&P companies and the services companies. Then the next one down, you've got, once you found the oil, if you found the oil, because sometimes a dry well, if you found the oil, you look at a midstream company, and this is a company that ships the oil. These are usually smaller companies. Again, Exxon doesn't own these. These are not like Halliburton. These are shipping companies or pipeline companies. And these are the big pipeline companies in the US, publicly traded, things like Enterprise, Energy Transfer, companies like that. And a lot of it, pipelines are natural gas, but they do oil as well. So these are companies that do the midstream. So the upstream is exploration and production and the services, doing that, the fracking and offshore drilling. The midstream is the transporting of the crude or their finished products. The midstream is called pipelines, tankers, rail cars. In the US, rail cars have kind of become popular over the last 10 years. And so that kind of midstream is the transporting oil, and then downstream is the refining. That's where these guys, you'll have an oil refinery, they'll buy the crude or a blend of crudes from a whole bunch of companies, and there's all these markets, physical oil broker markets. They buy them, and here you've got companies like Marathon or Valero, two big public companies in the US. And then around the world, you've got state-owned refineries, oil government-owned, and they basically, it's not a good business, as I mentioned earlier on. There's always overcapacity in the refining industry, and these guys refine the crude oil down into the refined products. So when people say, "Hey, what are oil markets doing today?" I always make sure people are talking about, you mean crude oil? Usually they mean crude oil. They don't mean gasoline or jet fuel or diesel or all the refined products that come out of a refinery. Usually they mean crude oil. So when people say oil in the oil industry, usually people mean, well, technically people say liquids. People actually don't even say the word, they do, but they say oil liquids, because oil liquids can be, nowadays with fracking, fracking, a side effect of that is that you produce a lot of very, very light oil, crude oil. So ethane, propane, butane, they call them NGLs. And so people in the oil industry don't say crude oil or oil, they do, but they generally say just liquids. I'm in the liquids business, to differentiate you from being in the natural gas business or the gas business. So we've got upstream, midstream. Upstream is they're looking for the oil, midstream is the transporting the oil, downstream is the refining oil into the finished product.
Let me ask you about the upstream. So,
Yeah.
so Elkton doesn't own the rigs, but why wouldn't they? Like, I thought, because they don't know capacity,
again,
right?
it's one of these other businesses where it's kind of a terrible business. Everyone builds these rigs, and sometimes they sit parked for years. You'll have these, like, when there's too many, because people, it's like the shipping business. People build too many ships, and then it's like overcapacity in the shipping industry for like 10 years, and then big long cycles, anything like shipping or oil rigs, any kind of heavy industrial, because these rigs are built in like shipyards in Korea and things like that. And it's a terrible business. You're just locking money up for 10 years. It's a big long cycle. You can't like move it easily.
Vertical integration makes no sense in the oil industry.
No,
You
not
better
really.
specialize.
It was a thing originally. It used to be vertically integrated.
Yeah,
A lot of companies
Rockefeller,
were
right?
originally. Rockefeller, he wanted, but he did it for monopolistic reasons. He wanted
Yeah.
to jack every part of that value chain he owned, because he jacked up the price of every part of the value chain. There was no competition. The Rockefeller Standard Oil was broken up, antitrust legislation in the U.S. in the in the 1900s, literally 1900s, and but all the companies that sprung out of that are like Exxon, uh, companies like, which is called SO outside the US. It's SO, Standard Oil. But Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, he started the big scaling up of the oil industry, and he really did control 90% plus of the oil industry originally. He was like, I think still to this day, he was if you inflation adjust, is the most wealthy individual ever in history. But still, he never flew in a jet. That's like
It's crazy,
a lot of these things. It's a good time to be alive today.
I know.
He was the guy who basically controlled, like, consolidated upstream, midstream, downstream. He owned everything. But that's how he really kind of took it too far when it was the transporting oil back then was in rail cars. You still get in the US today, and you just literally fill up these cars. You see big tanks on crude oil tanks on rail cars. In the US, it's very common. Other parts of the world, Russia, it's used as well. It's kind of expensive. I mean, the cheapest way to transport oil is pipe. And everyone, you get a lot of NIMBY people saying these days, "Oh, don't build pipelines." The US is, you can't go 5 miles in the US without hitting a nat gas oil pipe. They're everywhere. They're literally, it's too late now, is kind of like what I would say to people who want to stop pipelines. They're already everywhere. I mean, yes, there are new ones, and it's actually the safest way to transport oil is through a pipeline, because people, all these terrorists over the years have tried to blow up different pipes. It's the oil pipelines the easiest, not the easiest thing, but it's very easy to repair. Shut down production, shut down, supply, lift out the section, put the new section in, and 2 days later you're back up and running. It's not like a critical. The pipelines are important, but the only one that was recently was important was the Nord Stream one up in the Baltic Sea. But that was because that was a nat gas pipeline, and it's kind of strategic. But usually pipelines are the east are relatively easy to repair.
I've read that oil moves through pipeline slower than through the rail. Is it true? because they basically
Ah,
saying like it's not like
yeah, it
water.
would, that would make sense. Yeah, I can't remember the number, but I think it's oil moves
It's
through.
Buffett
You
said
know,
that because it's like
uh,
apparently
yeah,
it's not
it moves
because
slowly. Yeah, I think it's like 5 miles an hour through. Whereas a train through a pipeline, whereas through a train, obviously trains can move a lot, but they're
yeah
stopped a lot. Trains, and I think I can't remember the exact speed, but even big oil tankers in sea that move oil on seas, they don't really move that fast. They because as I said, if they speed up, they're burning. It's less efficient to move the oil. You have to push the water out as faster. So usually slower is better in the for efficiency reasons. And in the oil industry, efficiency, it is the most
yes
efficient
sounds like
operation. Not a drop is wasted. Everyone, because it's money, like literally, it's you. Everything is efficient. If you need to slow down the ship, the tanker, or slow down the rate of flow through the pipeline, or slow down to get efficiency, the industry will do it, or it'll speed it up depending on what's the most efficient. But yeah, it's a very efficient industry.
so. Speaking of individual names, like what companies consider to be like gold standard in terms of the operations? I'm not talking about stock price or anything, but like
Yeah, the gold standard operations. I mean, it's unusual for me to say it, but the number one oil company in the world is Saudi Aramco. They're in Saudi Arabia, and everyone looks at Saudi Aramco and goes, "Oh my God, they must be because they're in Saudi. They must be like a kind of backwards, I guess, because in the desert and it's their only industry." I went there a few years ago. They have a big compound up there in Dammam. It is the most advanced technological company. They hire from everywhere in the world, from universities in France and Germany, and all these flow engineers and hydrological engineers, because oil production is a very technically sophisticated um, uh, industry, and they're probably the one of the best, if not the best, mainly because they hire the best people. They hire and they pay really well. If you want to work and live in Saudi Arabia, they've got different facilities to live there for oil workers. But it's a complex business, especially say a country like Saudi. Saudi Aramco is the state-owned oil company. The reason it's called Aramco, by the way, is the original name was Saudi Arabian, sorry, Arabian American Oil Company,
mm,
Aramco. The AM is American because the US went and found oil there in the 1940s. Before then, Saudi Arabia was and kind of still is the desert. And they've literally, some guy had an ocean drilled and found one of the biggest, if not the biggest, oil reserves ever. And it's all dry land, which is the cheapest way to produce oil. And because you don't have to go offshore, you don't have to frack, you don't have to do anything special. The problem in Saudi is that they produce a lot of water with the oil. So, like in the oil reservoir, everyone thinks of oil as being like in a big lake, like in the ground. So
yeah
you go down 3 miles, 4 miles down. First of all, it's warm down there. The other way in a lot of mines, for mining operations in South Africa, one of the biggest costs is air conditioning because it's very hot because you're getting closer to the Earth's core. So oil in the reservoir is actually very warm. So when it comes up, it's warm, crude oil, because it's closer to the Earth's core. And so but it's in the ground, it's very often mixed with water. And so they have to dewater the oil. So in Saudi Arabia, a big problem is that I can't remember the ratio, but it's some very high ratios. And I'm going from memory here. 9 barrels of water have to be removed from the liquid that comes up with the ground for every 1 barrel of oil. It's some very high number of
oh wait
water.
you mean they kind of you have to separate
If there's
them
You have to separate the water from the oil in order to have
mm,
it as just crude oil. They have huge dewatering facilities in Saudi Aramco, and so to get the oil to market, they first of all have to remove all that water. So they have dewatering facilities, and the only way to do that is to kind of boil it off. That's
yeah
you have to boil off, though it's simple, but the operation is very efficient, but that they have to have dewatering. And so some people use the joke that Saudi Arabia is in the water production business with a little bit of oil, because they actually crude oil, they have to take out so much water from it. And what do they do with that water? It's a good question to ask. It's kind of contaminated, dirty water because it was mixed with the oil. This is not like surface water or ocean water. This is
mhm.
ancient water locked in, mixed in with the oil. And what they do is that they they take the water out of the oil, they separate it. I mean, the easiest way is just let it sit in a tank and oil and water separate that easily, or use a centrifuge as another way, or you can heat it as another way. There's all these different ways. You try and do it the cheapest way, but they take the water that comes out and they inject it back into the reservoir because to try and maintain the pressure in the reservoir. So
Hmm.
they take the oil out and they pump the water, the dirty water, if you will, it was in the ground. It's not like Saudi Arabia didn't create this pollution or anything. It was in the ground, it's naturally occurring. They just took the water out and they pump it back into the reservoir to maintain the reservoir pressure. And they can pump any other things. They could pump in carbon dioxide or other things, but just they pump the same water that came out an hour ago, it goes right back around and into the reservoir again to try and maintain. Because once reservoir pressures drop in a well, it's very hard to get it stimulated and restarted again. It's like a living, almost like a living creature, an oil well, in that you keep the flow going and everything you can do to keep that flow going. It requires a huge amount of technology. So they'll drill all these water wells, they'll drill the oil well, and then a few hundred feet this way, that way around a well, they'll drill water wells and pump the water that's been dewatered from the crude back into the reservoir to try and keep that pressure such that the crude comes up naturally. And so they pump the water back into the reservoir, and they are probably the most sophisticated oil company. In the US, you've got Texas Instruments. Remember that company made the
Yes.
calculators back in the day? The reason it's called Texas Instruments is that they started from the oil industry. All those computers and technology, the oil industry is probably the number one spender of money on chips and technology in the world for simulating. You go into, they don't just have things on paper. They have 3D simulations or
Hmm.
4D of the reservoir. It's huge. They have all these sensors on the surface, and they're using sound to get feedback and data. And they create this 3D image of the liquid in the ground. And sometimes it's not liquid, it's gas or liquid in the ground. And they say, okay, we drill down here, we could turn the lateral, the drill this way, or we can turn it that way. It'll cost us, 80 million to do this, 150 million to do that, or 40 million to do here. Well, the 120 million might be this probability of this much oil and this much flow. And they do all these huge, it's a hugely intense simulation of real world uh, uh, fluid dynamics, I guess, under the ground. So Saudi Aramco is probably one of the most sophisticated companies out there. Um, it's unfortunate for Saudi. It's the only industry they have. I mean, they have nothing else. They're trying to get into tourism and a few other things, but it's a very difficult switch. Dubai did it famously, switched from oil to they ran out back in the 90s. And after a good 20, 30 years, um, the UK ran out back in they found oil in the North Sea in the
Wait,
70s and
Dubai
80s.
Dubai ran out of oil?
They produced it all. After a while, it's not naturally occurring. You just get
Yeah.
it all and it's gone. And Dubai is a small area. It's part of the UAE, United Arab Emirates. So Abu Dhabi, which is, Dubai and Abu
Yeah.
Dhabi are 20 miles from each other, very close, 20, 30 kilometers. And you can drive just one to the other. So Dubai, they had a very small amount of oil. They produced it all. They knew it was declining because their production, once your production starts to decline, it's very hard to get it to recover
Yeah.
unless you use some new technology. But even then, it's difficult. And they made one of the most genius decisions in the 1980s, 1990s. They could see this coming. And because you can most countries, they can see when their production is starting to decline, it goes into a steady, inexorable decline. And they said, we're going to take these, whatever millions we've got left. There's a small population of a few 100,000 people in Dubai. And they said, we're going to build a tourism
Tourism, yeah.
city, like Las Vegas, and it worked. I
Yeah.
mean, they adopted London, UK laws as their law. It's like the Las Vegas of the Middle East. Everyone from Saudi and Iran and everyone there, they all go to party in Dubai and they go home to their own, very conservative country. But it's the party city of the Middle East, the closest one to, any country there. And so they're one country that made the transition. Norway is obviously a famous case of a country they're still producing a lot of oil, but they made the transition they're still, it's a very, that industry has kind of made life in Norway very difficult for other industries because Norway is a very expensive place to live now because there's so
Hmm.
much oil money in that country. But Dubai is probably one of the few places in the world they pivoted. No other, very few countries ever have pivoted like that.
Let's go back to the Saudi Aramco. So I'm guessing they have the lowest cost of production despite all of the.
Yes, still roughly the lowest cost of production, except here's the way it's the wrinkle with that is yes, they produce oil at, famously $10, $20 a barrel, something like that. So
Hmm.
where we are today, 80, you'd say, oh, well, they're making $70 or $60 a barrel. The problem is they have a very strange government. It's a very conservative government. They're basically like desert Bedouin communities that all of a sudden have got hugely rich. It's still a monarchy.
Hmm.
It is the kingdom of Saudi Arabia,
Yes.
and they have a very young population. They have no other industry other than oil. They have a very fast-growing population, and so in order to keep the population happy, I'm not saying there's anything wrong or right with it, because hey, they got the money. They basically give all these kind of free education, free healthcare, free this, free that, welfare, hugely welfare state. And so the true cost of, if you cost the cost of the government, because
Mm.
the government only source of money is the oil industry, the cost of their balancing their budget is $80 a barrel. That's why it's not going to, we're not going to, that's why the Saudis have cut, are the one swing producer in the world. They need 70, $80 a barrel to balance their budget, because if oil goes to 50, they have to cut back on some of this welfare. And some of these kids in Saudi and Riyadh may not be too happy with the king or the ruling families, the Sauds, if they're not getting free healthcare for their kids, or if they're not getting cheap subsidized goods. I mean, it's kind of like in Russia. If
Mhm.
oil goes to 40 or 50, that's a big problem for Putin, in that he basically has to. The only way he's going to fund this war is with $80 oil. If it goes down to 40, it's going to be tough. I mean,
Mhm.
so it's not just because there's the cost of actually physically producing, which is like what Exxon does, or Chevron or Occidental in the US. They're the true cost. They're like, say, Oxy. Their cost of production is in the Permian down in Texas is probably all in fully loaded $40 a barrel, give or take.
Relative
But
to
Saudi,
Exxon.
Exxon, say they're roughly similar, say,
Mhm.
cost of production, because Exxon is now they've bought a lot of, they're trying to buy their way into the fracking business. They have bought it their way in. But so say it's $40 a barrel is the marginal cost of production in the US for a crude oil producer. In Saudi Arabia, the cost of production is probably 10 or $20 a barrel. And like that's what Saudi Aramco's costs.
Mhm.
Then all the welfare to keep the country not overrunning the oil compounds and the oil production facilities
Yeah.
is 60, 70. So the break-even cost of the government there before they have to borrow money is $80 a barrel. So it's 20 is their actual cost of production if they were a private company, profit maximizing. But because they're part of the state, it's $80 a barrel. It's all the rest is welfare state for the Saudi people. I'm
How
not saying
much
it's good or bad. It's good just the way it is. Yeah.
how much oil reserve they still have? And like what's the oil reserve on the earth and what's gonna happen by the way?
Oh yeah. So
Still there.
there's this whole debate. It started in the 2010s or 20s, the 2000s, 2005. And it was that Saudi Arabia was going to run out of oil. And eventually they will run out of oil. There's this theory, it's called abiotic theory of oil production, that, I mean, oil is a hydrocarbon. You look at it's methane, methane is the simplest hydrocarbon. And then you get down to ethane, propane, butane, there's all these anes in there.
Yeah.
But basically, hydrogen and carbon. And the reason they're so valuable is that when you add oxygen to that burning, in other words, you just take oxygen from the air, it produces heat. It releases heat and water and carbon dioxide. So they're the three things that it releases. Carbon dioxide, global warming, whatever, that's a thing. Uh, but it releases heat. You can use it for an engine. Heat can be boiling water, spin a turbine, move a piston. That's what so you add hydrocarbon plus oxygen. You heat it up to get the chemical process going, and it produces way more heat than you started with in
Mhm.
to get the process going. And water, and so the smoke coming out of a tailpipe on a cold day is mostly water vapor from the hydrocarbon with the oxygen reacts, produce water, don't suck in a tailpipe. By the way, there's also carbon monoxide and other small trace elements that are not good. But there's this theory that the core of the Earth is full of methane, or it's full of, or has a lot of methane, and that anything comes up and is trapped is actually generated not by material algae rotting and decaying, or not rotting, being trapped over millions of years and turning slowly into coal and hydrocarbons. Is that it actually was pockets of methane trapped inside the Earth's core, coming up and being into trapped by rocks as they comes up. That's a theory. The thing that goes against that theory is that almost every oil basin and natural gas hydrocarbon basin in the world is found in sedimentary basins. And these are old oil delta, or old river deltas where slow moving materials drop slowly to the seabed in an area was called anoxic, no oxygen. And it's, so in other words, it falls down to, if you put something in an area with no oxygen, it doesn't rot because there's no bacteria down there. And slowly over time, millions of years, literally millions, not thousands or hundreds of years, millions of years, all these riverbeds like the Mississippi Delta and places like that, but old ones from millions of years ago, those old sedimentary basins, sedimentary because it's a fall of sediment, turned into hydrocarbons. Like originally, we coal first, then oil, and then natural gas. But it has to be trapped by some geological
Mm-hmm.
movement. And most of the oil, the reason against there be just being like the abiotic theory of there's huge amounts of oil and gas in the world, it's just we don't need these sedimentary basins. People say, oh, methane is trapped in the Earth's core, it just happens to be coming up in sedimentary basins. The huge argument against that, arguing that there's a limited amount of oil in the world, is that oil is only found pretty much in sedimentary basins, old riverbeds that have slowed down and over millions of years. And there's only a limited amount of oil. And so most oil producers, if you drill anywhere, eventually, not eventually, starts from day one, the decline curve sets in. You produce, the Pennsylvania used to be a huge oil producer, crude oil producer. And then eventually you produce it all. And then you have to drill somewhere else. You can try and go back and apply new technologies to that ground. But basically, oil is a depleting reserve. There's only so much there because
Mm-hmm.
only so many things died and turned into oil over time. It's not like it's growing. I mean, oil is it's not huge amounts aren't being produced every day, so it's a depleting resource. And so here's the thing: how much is it left in the ground? How much the Saudis have? How much does the US
Yeah.
have? How much? And a lot of companies that when they go through stating their reserves, how much they think they have in the ground, there's a huge amount of oil in Saudi Arabia left. I don't think they really have a good handle themselves. They know what the rate of production they can produce. They're producing around 9 million barrels a day right now. I'll remember total world production 100 million. The US produces 20 million. Saudi Arabia produces 9 million. Saudis, I think, know that they can get up to 10 or 11 or 12 million barrels per day at a rate. But for how long? Can they do that for the next 100 years? Remember, they only started producing at this kind of scale in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. I don't think they know themselves. I bet you they internally are kind of happy they got to here. They're applying all these new technologies, injecting the water and whatnot back into the reservoirs. But eventually, that's going to go away, and Saudi Arabia will eventually be a desert again. I mean, that's why the MBS, the Mohammed bin Sultan, the current leader of Saudi, he's trying to have this new push towards diversifying their economy to like Dubai did to tourism and technology and all of that because eventually this will go away, that oil industry. It's not
But
like
eventually, you said like might be 100 years or what? Like,
no, I mean it would be maybe 30 years, 20 years.
I see.
Yeah, I mean,
But oil
it
consumption.
could be wrong, but
Yeah.
it eventually will go. Like you can't. Building. It's like building a house in on the border of Vesuvius in just outside near Naples in
Mm-hmm.
Italy. You know, eventually that earthquake, that volcano is going to erupt. You know it. You can build a nice house there and put it, or building a house in Florida in the Hurricane Alley. You know that it's going to be Saudi Arabia. It is guaranteed that their production will fall. The challenge is estimating when it will happen. Is it this decade, next decade, 2 decades from now? It will happen. They can apply technology, and I'm sure they will do that. But it's very, very difficult. And not only then is there how much oil, if you say if oil is say Brazil famously has got this used to be called the Tupi field way offshore. There's offshore oil which is on the instead like the Gulf of Mexico, North Sea, where you can actually have the rig stand on the ground. It'll be a really tall, like skyscraper-ish type rig, but it is actually the structure of that steel is on the ground of the floor. That's on the continental shelf. That's expensive. Like that's say 40, $50 offshore oil. Then you go deep offshore or ultra deep offshore where you go off the continental shelf where it's 3 miles down. You have to float the rig. You can't, there's no steel structure you can put down to the ground apart from the pipe producing. And that oil, Brazil has got a huge amount of oil there. Huge. The problem is to produce that oil needs $200 a barrel. So there's a huge amount of oil at 150 available in the world at $200. There's up in the Arctic. If oil gets up to $200 a barrel, we'll produce oil from the Arctic. We know there's oil up there. And that's why there's this whole geopolitical shenanigans about who owns the North Pole, who owns,
Oh, I see.
because as the ice melts, you can do more easy exploration. So there's a lot of, we're moving up the cost curve. We move from cheap onshore drilling on dry land. That was up until the 2000s. Then we moved into fracking. That brings it up from $20 a barrel to $40 a
40.
barrel. And then now the next stage is, and offshore oil is around $40, $50 a barrel as well. Now we're moving into ultra deep offshore. That goes up to the cost of production, $150 a barrel. We know the oil is there, huge amounts of it offshore, way off in the middle of the Atlantic, offshore Brazil, and up in the Arctic. It's called Arctic oil, $150, $200 a barrel. So the definition of reserves depends on what the price is.
I
And
see.
so it
I
moves
see.
with, yeah. So here at 80, you can produce fracking oil and you can produce conventional onshore oil if you have it, if you're lucky enough to have it, like Saudi does.
What about the consumption of oil, right? It's continued growing and it's
Yeah,
expected to continue growing. Like, what about this alternatives and electric cars? Has it changed much?
it's changed a lot, but it hasn't really impacted the oil industry yet. And I
Mhm.
don't know if it ever necessarily will, at least over our lifetimes. Here's the thing: oil consumption is very stable. It grows with population. Here's the interesting statistic. Over the last 50 years, oil consumption has been 4 barrels per person per year. And it's just grown with population. It's on the, if you've got a supply and demand analyst for oil, the
Mhm.
easiest thing to model is actually the demand side, the consumption side, because people are, especially when you get into huge numbers, 8 billion people are predictable. They fly the similar amount every day. They drive to and from school. They drive to and from their home, work. They demand the same shipping of products from demand. So at scale, oil consumption grows with population very stably. Um, eventually countries reach a certain plateau depending on the geography of the country. In the US, oil consumption plateaued at around 20 barrels per person per year. And because the US is very fragmented population, people drive a lot. They live very far away. That's why public transport doesn't work very well in the US. So everyone drives to and from where they need to get. In Europe, much more dense. The population density is much higher. You can use public transport. They don't consume as much oil. It's around between 10 and 15 million, 10 and 15 barrels per person. And then you get to countries where they're developing. China would still be in there, where the consumption is around between 5 and 10 barrels per person. But eventually, consumption is the very predictable side of the oil demand. It grows with population, grows at 1-2% a year, very stably, very predictable. The supply side of the oil equation is the difficult thing to predict because of shutdowns of wars and things like that of different producers. The consumption side very relatively easy to predict. And so, but here's the thing: oil. Over the last few years, electric cars and electric cars are, I think they're 15-20% of new car sales this year. We're in 2023, 2024.
Mhm.
So 2024, say 20% of the world's new car sales are electric cars. Those electric cars are offsetting oil consumption because usually the electricity for that comes from coal or nat gas, and to a lesser degree nuclear or solar and wind. But mainly it's electricity. So it's 20% of new cars sold of passenger vehicles are electric cars. The problem is the scale. The average car in the US is on the road, has been on the road is 18 years. So
Mhm.
the average car driven in the US today is 18 years old. You drive because cars last forever. They've been so well engineered over time. They don't really rust that much. You can just repair them. They last a very, very long time. So it's at a record high. It's been slowly drifting up over time. So there's a huge base of about 2 billion vehicles in the world today that are actually driving. Of those, I think it's 20 or 30 million are electric so far. So it's going to take a while for the world to transition. I mean, the car industry is a big thing in itself, but it's kind of like it's like talking about the orange juice business and you're in the beverages industry. That's what like talking about electric cars in the oil
Mhm.
industry is. As in, yeah, orange juice is very important, but it's like 1-2% of the global beverage industry. And that's what electric cars are like. It's important and it's growing fast, but it's still very, very small versus the oil industry. So oil consumption is going to be very strong for the next 10, 15 years, but electric cars are growing and growing very fast. I think much more important than electric cars, which I think is a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's a very, very good thing for us to have a diverse source of transport. I think actually a much more important thing is things like working from home and also people traveling less over time. I think
Mhm.
people with the development of AI and whatnot and working from home are going to consume less from that, not from using alternative methods of transport, electric cars, but actually from traveling less. If you have AI, you slip on the new, goggles from Meta or whatever, I don't have one, but you can
Mm.
imagine in 10 years' time, you don't need to go on vacation to France. You can just see the Eiffel Tower in pretty much full detail as if you're right there. So I think that not electric cars, I think the big change in the oil consumption side will be people traveling less, people just using their computers, doing a video call like we're doing right now.
Yep.
It just becomes less. And as that becomes more real, like as in, say 10 years from now, I'm sure we can do it now at cutting edge, but 10 years from now, it'll be natural that you and I will actually think we're in the same room. We'll put whatever goggles or earphones on,
Hmm.
and it kind of will have this. So do we need to travel as much for meetings and for, the conferences and for schools and things like that? I think that the advent of technology that stops people from actually needing to go out more, that is probably likely to transform the consumption side of the oil industry more so than electric cars. Electric cars are still nibbling at the edges, but not in a major way. I mean, electric cars are, if anything, causing a little bit more oil demand in the short term, just because electric cars use electricity, which usually in the US, at least in a lot of places, nat gas. That nat gas comes from, as a co-product of producing crude oil. So um, that's a long way of saying it. Consumption is very stable at a global level for crude oil, but electric cars, it's a very hugely interesting and very innovative part of the industry. But at scale, it isn't, not over the next 3 to 10 years, won't have a huge impact on the oil industry itself. And but I think, who knows, maybe it does change, but remember, 2 billion vehicles on the road, 20, 30 million or something like that are electric at the moment. It needs to get to a lot more scale before it has a dent in oil consumption, which is said, very predictable. And even things like electric airplanes, these things are, they're coming probably, but not at scale in the next. The thing about oil is it's cheap and it's very energy dense.
Hmm.
That's the As I said, everyone talks about the watching the Fed and watching this. Look at oil. Oil is basically two things that have caused deflation and are continuing to cause deflation over the last 20, 30 years. One is the sudden emergence of Chinese labor into the global market, people that would work for a fifth of what people in the US and Europe would work for. That's dissipating now, that effect. But that was a huge deflationary for investor impact over the 1990s, 2010s, and 2020, 20 up to the 2020 period. But also over that period, oil prices, cheap oil availability, and continues to be every year in real terms, oil prices are becoming 2 to 5% more efficient. They're like the oil industry is extracting more and more efficiency out of the industry,
Mm.
such that oil is still very cheap. The main thing to compete with for oil is that it's cheap and it's very dense, energy dense. Yeah.
So you think when oil gonna, let's say at some point it will might cost, let's say, $200, but chances are that it's gonna be so efficient that we're not gonna even feel it much because the gasoline will be the same prices, you think?
I think initially it might get to $200 if we get, just like we had to get up to $100 for 5 years, 2010, so 2019, sorry, 2009 to 2014, oil averaged $100. And we got up to that. Fracking was kind of unlocked by getting to that
Mm-hmm.
supply curve. If we have a decline in fracking supply and a decline in conventional, which is just drill straight down kind of old school on land supply, we may need to go to $150, $200 for a period of time to unlock ultra deep offshore and also Arctic oil reserves. But then it might only stay up there for a few years, 4 or 5 years, to pay for all the early E&P companies to get out there and try it. And because it's so, a lot of these Brazilian companies tried it when oil was $100. You had the state oil company in Brazil, as well as I'm trying to think of the name. It was with the guy who was the richest guy in the world for a few days. He started
Oh,
an
I
oil company
remember that.
in
Had like
Brazil. I met him,
company's name.
Ernesto Batista. What was
Yes, yeah.
his company's name?
X
X or something?
XTPs, X like all
Ah, there
like
was an X in there. God damn it! These companies, these billionaires and their X this,
yeah.
X that. It was called something X, yeah, whatever it was called. And they had a go at it. They tried to borrow a huge amount of money, and the state government in Brazil tried it as well, and they just couldn't hack it. I mean, they
Mm.
can get the oil out, but it's $150 to $200. So it's a very, very expensive proposition to unlock that level. but maybe we'll go there for a few years if the world demands it.
Yeah, actually, we covered a lot on oil.
These days, I'm most interested in the electrification of transport. So, battery technology. And so that I've been kind of dabbling in that kind of industry. Yeah, it's a very interesting space, that whole electrification of transport. I mean, it doesn't have a huge impact, as I said, at scale compared to the oil industry at the moment, but it is an interesting kind of space, electric cars and grid stabilization technology, these virtual power plants where you put a huge battery connected to a grid, so you don't have to, so you can actually remove peaker plants, what they're called, these kind of on-demand electricity production facilities. So that's kind of an area I'm kind of working on and interested in most now, the whole electrification of the world, and particularly batteries, like that battery technology.
Is it your next book going to be about?
I was thinking of writing Electricity 101. It's actually a fascinating area just because it is the amount of innovation that's happening right now, which is batteries alone, and the cost of producing batteries. I mean, China is leading the way. It's a very fast moving market, just the chemistry involved. It reminds me a lot of, it doesn't remind me, but it reminds me of the history of the oil industry when it kind of just got started. People are taking, huge risks. A lot of these new car startups have come and gone. And some of them are still around, the Teslas of the world, but a lot of these battery companies. So it's kind of a very, very interesting space, kind of combining industry and chemistry. I guess it's kind of two areas, but that's kind of what I'm working on right now, is just that space, the batteries, electrification.
Well, Morgan, thanks very much for being on the podcast.